My name is Fiona, and I am 33 years old. After my divorce, my ex-husband and his expensive lawyers made sure I lost everything. As I stood shivering in the freezing Chicago rain watching my own sister laugh on the porch of the home I paid for, I realized family could be your deadliest enemy. But before I tell you how a stranger in a black town car changed my destiny and helped me claim a $99 million revenge, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debts. The rain was coming down in relentless freezing sheets. It was one of those bitter autumn storms that sweeps off Lake Michigan and cuts right through your winter coat, sinking deep into your bones. I stood at the end of the long sweeping driveway of the $2.5 million suburban estate I had designed and maintained for the last 6 years. My hands were numb and shaking, wrapped tightly around a soaked cardboard box that was rapidly disintegrating in the downpour. Two heavily built private security guards, hired by my ex-husband Preston, were hauling heavy black trash bags and plastic bins out of the front double doors. They were tossing my carefully preserved life onto the wet concrete without a single ounce of care or hesitation. Inside those boxes were the priceless remnants of my botanical archivist business. Dried plant specimens dating back decades, meticulously cataloged soil samples, and historic landscape designs I had spent my entire adult life researching and curating. I watched in absolute horror as a plastic bin slipped from a guard's hands and shattered against the pavement. The impact sent fragile glass slides and rare pressed orchids spilling out into the muddy puddles. Years of painstaking research washed away in seconds, floating down the driveway toward the storm drain. I took a desperate step forward to salvage them, but one of the guards held up a massive hand, warning me to stay back. On the covered wraparound porch, perfectly dry and illuminated by the warm golden glow of the expensive exterior lights, stood Preston. He was 36 years old, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. He was holding a crystal glass filled with expensive scotch, swirling the amber liquid slowly. He was smiling a relaxed, triumphant smile that made my empty stomach churn with nausea. But he was not alone. Leaning against the wooden porch railing, wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater that she had apparently decided to claim from my closet, was my younger sister Diana. She was 30, the undisputed golden child of the Whitmore family, and right now she was laughing. It was a bright, musical laugh that cut through the heavy sound of the pouring rain and struck me like a physical blow to the chest. I walked slowly up the driveway, my boots splashing heavily in the deep puddles. "Diana, look at me," I shouted over the howling wind. "How can you stand there with him, after everything he did to me today in front of that judge?" Diana took a slow sip from her own glass of champagne and looked down at me from the elevated steps. Her perfectly manicured face was completely devoid of sympathy. "Do not look so shocked, Fiona," she called back, her voice dripping with absolute condescension. "You brought this entirely on yourself. Mom and I simply told the judge the truth. We could not let you ruin your own life anymore." "The truth," I repeated, my voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. "You told the judge I was dangerously unhinged. You committed perjury." The events of the morning played over in my mind like a terrifying nightmare loop I could not escape. We had been in family court for the final asset division of my divorce. I had expected a fair split given that I had contributed equally to our finances. Instead, Preston's high-powered legal team had ambushed me with a calculated strike. They filed an emergency motion to seize all marital assets and gain complete control over my botanical consulting firm. To prove I was unfit to manage my own finances or my company, they brought forward two surprise character witnesses, my own sister Diana and our mother Beatrice. I had stood completely frozen in that sterile courtroom as the women who shared my blood swore under oath that I was suffering from severe mental instability. Diana had sat in the witness box and cried fake theatrical tears, claiming I had violent outbursts and could not be trusted to make rational business decisions. Our mother Beatrice had corroborated every single vicious lie. She told the judge I had a long history of dangerous paranoia that required immediate legal intervention. They painted a picture of a woman entirely detached from reality, someone who needed to be stripped of her autonomy for her own good. The judge, overwhelmed by the tearful testimony of a concerned mother and sister, granted Preston everything. "You are my sister!" I yelled up at the porch, the freezing rain mixing with the hot tears streaming down my face. "Mom is my mother. Why would you destroy my life just to help Preston take my business from me?" Diana rolled her eyes and exchanged a knowing, smug glance with Preston. "Because you were embarrassing the family, Fiona. You have always been so obsessed with dirt and old leaves instead of real corporate business. Preston knows how to turn a profit. Mom and I agreed that Caldwell Enterprises could do much more with your little consulting firm than you ever could. Plus, Preston promised to set up a nice trust for Mom's retirement. It was a win for everyone." Preston finally stepped forward, resting his hands on the smooth wooden railing. "Your sister is just being practical, Fiona," he said, his voice smooth and arrogant. "The judge recognized that you do not have the mental fortitude to manage a growing enterprise or a house of this magnitude. I am genuinely doing you a favor. I am going to liquidate those worthless historical archives, clear out that ridiculous greenhouse you built out back, and sell the firm's assets to a commercial developer. It is just good business. You never had the stomach for the real corporate world anyway." Liquidate my firm. The words felt like bitter ash in my mouth. I had spent 8 grueling years building that botanical consulting company from the ground up. I worked 80-hour weeks researching historic properties, restoring heritage gardens for elite clients, and fighting to protect endangered city landscapes. It was my passion, my identity, and my sole source of independent income. Preston had never cared about it when we were married, constantly referring to it as a cute little hobby. But the moment we filed for divorce, he saw the immense financial value of the corporate contracts I had secured. He realized my elite client list was worth millions to his massive corporate development firm. He just needed me legally out of the way so he could orchestrate a hostile takeover and absorb my clients. "You should be thanking us," Diana sneered, tossing her damp blonde hair over her shoulder. "Mom and I saved you from a stressful public trial. Now you can finally go get the psychiatric help you clearly need to fix your broken brain. And do not even think about calling Mom for a place to stay tonight. She is completely exhausted from having to testify today. The emotional toll you put her through was just too much. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute and deeply calculated that I felt my knees actually buckle beneath me. I caught myself against the cold, wet hood of my old sedan that was parked at the bottom of the driveway. My mother and sister had not just failed to support me during a brutal divorce proceeding. They had actively conspired with my abusive ex-husband to ensure I walked away with absolutely nothing. They had traded my sanity, my home, and my livelihood for whatever financial promises or payouts Preston had secretly offered them behind closed doors. They had sold me out for a retirement fund and a few glasses of champagne. The security guards threw the last of my garbage bags onto the growing pile on the driveway. One of the bags split open on the jagged concrete, revealing my winter clothes, shoes, and favorite books, instantly soaking up the filthy, muddy water. "That is everything, boss," the larger guard called up to Preston, wiping rain from his forehead. Preston nodded, taking a final satisfied sip of his scotch. "Escort her off the property line, gentlemen. If she tries to step foot on the driveway again, call the police and report a mentally unstable trespasser. I will not have her harassing my guests." Diana raised her champagne glass in a mocking, graceful toast. "Have a nice life, Fiona. Try to stay out of the rain. It is really bad for your fragile mental state." They turned their backs on me, laughing loudly together as they walked inside the massive house I had spent years turning into a beautiful home. The heavy custom oak door slammed shut, locking with a loud, definitive click that echoed across the property. A second later, the porch light snapped off, plunging me entirely into cold, harsh darkness. I was left standing alone in the freezing downpour, shivering violently and gasping for breath as the reality of my situation finally settled over me. I dropped to the cold, wet ground beside the ruined, broken boxes of my botanical archives, tracing my fingers over a shattered glass frame. This was the physical evidence of everything I had loved, worked for, and lost in a single devastating day. My entire world had been orchestrated into a complete, undeniable collapse by the exact people who were supposed to love me most. The rain washed away my tears, but it could not wash away the burning anger that was slowly replacing my overwhelming grief. Headlights sliced through the freezing sheets of rain, casting long, harsh shadows across the scattered remains of my life. A sleek silver Mercedes glided up the driveway, its tires hissing smoothly against the wet pavement. I knew that car. I knew the vanity license plate, and I knew the woman sitting behind the steering wheel. My mother, Beatrice Whitmore, had arrived. For a brief, foolish fraction of a second, the wounded child inside me hoped she had come to rescue me. I thought that maybe, despite her testimony in court, seeing her eldest daughter shivering and homeless in a torrential downpour would trigger some buried maternal instinct. I pulled myself up off the wet concrete, hugging my soaked coat tightly around my chest, and waited. The driver's side door swung open. A heavy black umbrella blossomed into the night, protecting my mother from the elements before her leather boots touched the ground. She stepped out wearing a pristine trench coat. Beatrice carried herself with the terrifying poise of a woman who had spent decades managing her social status. She did not look at me or ask if I was freezing. Instead, she reached into her car and pulled out a gold-foiled velvet box. "Mother," I gasped, my teeth chattering so violently I could barely form the word. "Please, I have nowhere to go." "They took everything." Beatrice paused halfway up the driveway. She slowly turned her head and looked down at me from beneath the rim of her umbrella. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of pity. "You did this to yourself, Fiona," she said, her voice sharp and steady, cutting through the roar of the storm. "I raised you to be a winner. I gave you every advantage, every connection, and every tool necessary to secure a prominent place in Chicago society. Instead, you chose to play in the dirt. You chose to obsess over dead plants and historical soil records. And worst of all, you failed to keep a successful, ambitious man happy." Preston stepped down from the porch, ignoring my presence, and greeted her with a warm embrace. Beatrice smiled genuinely for the first time all day. She handed him the velvet box. "A vintage Dom Perignon, Preston," she announced proudly, "to celebrate your promotion to CEO and the successful acquisition of those botanical contracts. You earned this." Preston laughed, taking the bottle. "Thank you, Beatrice. Your testimony today was invaluable. We could not have secured the assets without you and Diana confirming her fragile mental state." I watched the exchange with a sickening knot forming in my stomach. My own mother was gifting my abusive ex-husband luxury champagne to celebrate the theft of my company. I had spent 8 years building that firm, and my mother was toasting to its destruction. "You sold me out," I whispered, stepping closer, but keeping a careful distance from the guards. "You stood in a court of law and told a judge I was insane. How much did he pay you, Mother? How much was your daughter worth?" Beatrice stiffened, her posture straightening as she gripped the handle of her umbrella. "Preston did not pay me a dime." She snapped, her tone dripping with venom. "He simply offered to clean up the mess you made. You are a massive disappointment, Fiona. You lack vision. You lack drive. You let your marriage fall apart because you were too stubborn to play the role of a supportive corporate wife. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is for me to answer questions about you at the country club? Do you know how humiliating it is to admit my eldest daughter is a failed consultant facing a high-profile divorce?" "I am your daughter," I pleaded, wrapping my arms tighter around myself as the wind howled. "I have no money." Preston froze my accounts. "I do not even have money for a hotel room tonight. Please, Mother, just let me sleep in my old room at the Whitmore estate, just for a few days until I can figure out a plan." Beatrice looked at me as if I had just asked to burn her house to the ground. "Absolutely not," she said firmly. "You are explicitly banned from the family estate. The gates will not open for you, and the security staff has already been instructed to turn you away. I will not have your toxic energy and your dramatic failures polluting my home. Diana and Preston are the future of this family legacy. You are nothing but a liability. You cannot do this! I sobbed, the cold rainwater mixing with the hot tears streaming down my cheeks. The Whitmore estate belonged to grandfather. He would never have allowed you to throw me out on the street. Beatrice let out a short, bitter laugh. Your grandfather is dead. Fiona and his outdated sentimental ideals died with him. The estate belongs to me now. I make the rules. And my rule is that failures do not get to sleep under my roof. She turned away from me, dismissing my existence entirely. Let us go inside, Preston. I cannot wait to get out of this dreadful weather. Preston nodded, flashing me one final victorious smirk. He turned and escorted my mother up the steps to the porch where Diana was waiting. The three of them stood together, a perfectly coordinated portrait of wealth and cruelty. Diana raised her glass one last time, taking a slow, deliberate sip before turning her back on me. They walked through the massive double doors, and the heavy wood shut solidly behind them. The security guards retreated to their vehicles, rolling up their tinted windows and leaving me entirely alone in the darkness. The silence that followed was broken only by the relentless pounding of the rain against the pavement. The storm seemed to mock my absolute ruin. I stood in the driveway staring at the house that was no longer mine. The warm light spilling from the massive bay windows felt like a cruel taunt. I could see their silhouettes moving around the dining room, pouring champagne and celebrating the execution of my life. I was a ghost haunting my own grave. My body was trembling so violently that my teeth ached. The wool coat I wore was entirely soaked through, clinging to my skin like a wet blanket. My fingers were turning pale blue from the plunging temperature. I dragged my heavy boots across the pavement, moving toward the scattered remains of my belongings. The cardboard boxes Preston men had thrown out were rapidly turning to mush in the puddles. My carefully organized life was now just debris. I knelt beside a crushed box, picking up the ruined items. A framed photograph of my botanical archiving certification was shattered. I pulled the wet paper from the frame and let the wind carry it away. My favorite heavy reference books of historic landscape architecture were waterlogged and ruined, their pages bleeding ink onto the driveway. I found a few items of clothing tucked inside a plastic bin that had miraculously survived the fall. I pulled out a thick sweater and wrapped it around my neck, desperate for any source of warmth. I desperately needed to get out of the storm and figure out how to survive the night. With numb, clumsy fingers, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. The screen was cracked from when one of the guards had shoved me earlier, but it still turned on. The harsh white light of the screen illuminated the dark driveway. I opened my banking application, praying that Preston lawyers had left me something. Just a fraction of the joint savings account. Just enough to book a cheap motel room and buy a hot meal. The loading circle spun for what felt like an eternity. When the numbers finally appeared on the cracked glass, my heart stopped completely. Available balance, $34.12. I stared at the screen, unblinking. $34, that was the sum total of my net worth. A 33-year-old woman with a brilliant career reduced to the price of a cheap dinner. Preston had moved everything. He had frozen the joint accounts, liquidated the business assets, and transferred the operational funds to holding accounts I could no longer access. The judge order had given him the legal right to strip me bare. I locked the phone and let my shaking hand drop to my side. There was no one left to call. My mother had banned me from the family home. My sister had conspired against me. My ex-husband had robbed me. The few friends I had made during my marriage were Preston corporate colleagues, and they had already cut ties. I was completely isolated. The freezing rain continued to beat down mercilessly, flattening my wet hair against my skull. I slowly lowered myself onto a large, overturned plastic bin, pulling my knees to my chest to conserve heat. I sat there in the dark driveway of a $2.5 million mansion, holding the soaked remains of my life work, knowing I had exactly $34 to my name. The freezing rain battered my shoulders as I stared blankly at the wet pavement. I calculated how long I could sit there before hypothermia set in, when blinding headlights cut through the storm. A sleek black town car glided silently toward me. It stopped at the curb precisely where Preston guards had dumped my ruined belongings. The engine purred with an expensive resonance. I squinted, expecting Preston to have called the police to remove me for trespassing. The heavy rear door swung open. A woman stepped out onto the flooded street. She deployed a large black umbrella, shielding herself from the downpour. Even in the miserable lighting, I could tell she certainly did not work for my ex-husband. She wore an impeccably tailored navy pantsuit that exuded absolute authority. She appeared to be in her early 50s, with sharp features and silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. She walked toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the wet concrete. She stopped a few feet away from my overturned plastic bin. She did not look at me with pity. Her dark eyes scanned my soaked clothes, my shivering frame, and the shattered glass of my botanical displays scattered across the mud. Her gaze was purely analytical. "Are you Fiona Whitmore?" she asked. Her voice was crisp, clear, and entirely devoid of warmth. I pulled my wet coat tighter around my chest, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Yes," I managed to say, my voice sounding weak over the howling wind. "Who are you? Did Preston send you to threaten me again?" "He already took everything. I have nothing left to steal." The woman did not react to my panic. She reached inside her blazer and produced a small leather wallet. "I need to see a government-issued identification," she stated plainly. "I must verify your identity before we proceed any further." My frozen fingers fumbled in my coat pocket until I retrieved my soaked wallet. I pulled out my driver license and held it up with a shaking hand. The woman retrieved a silver penlight, shining the narrow beam directly onto my card. She scrutinized the photo, checked the name, and compared it to my bruised face. After a moment, she clicked the light off and nodded. "You may put that away, Fiona," she said. "My name is Patricia Gallagher. I am the senior managing partner at Gallagher and Hayes Estate Law. Let me assure you right now that I do not work for Preston Caldwell. I do not work for your mother, Beatrice. I have no interest in the corporate theft that occurred inside that house. I represent a single client, and my firm has represented him exclusively for 30 years. I stared at her, completely bewildered. "If you do not work for Preston, why are you here? I do not have an estate. I have $34 to my name and nowhere to sleep tonight. I am here on behalf of Silas Whitmore," she announced, her voice steady against the storm. The name hit me like a physical shock. Great Uncle Silas. I blinked rain from my eyelashes, searching my memory. Silas was my mother-uncle. He was the ultimate taboo subject in the Whitmore household. For my entire life, Beatrice used Silas as the cautionary tale of failure. According to family lore, Silas had been a reckless black sheep who squandered his portion of the family inheritance. Beatrice claimed the family formally disowned him to protect their reputation. She told everyone he lived in squalor on the South Side and died penniless. Just last Thanksgiving, Diana made a cruel joke, warning me that if I kept playing with plants, I would end up a beggar just like crazy Uncle Silas. "He is dead," I said, my voice trembling. "My mother told me he died broke years ago. She said he was a complete failure." Ms. Gallagher let out a sharp, humorless laugh, sounding like cracking ice. "Your mother, Beatrice, is an arrogant woman who chooses to believe her own manufactured reality. Silas Whitmore did not die years ago. He passed away exactly 3 days ago. And let me be absolutely clear about one thing. Silas was many things, but he was not a failure, and he was not broke." I pulled myself up slightly from the plastic bin, clutching my freezing arms. "But my mother said the family cut him off. She said he lost everything. When your mother and her father pushed Silas out of the family business, they did him the greatest favor of his life," Ms. Gallagher explained, her tone dripping with professional admiration. "They thought they stripped him of his power. Instead, they stripped him of his restraints. Silas moved into the shadows of the global commodities market. He traded agricultural futures, shipping lanes, and commercial real estate. He built an empire far away from the pathetic social climbing circles your mother cares about. He was a ruthless, brilliant billionaire. He owned fleets of cargo ships and massive commercial properties. He became the quietest, most powerful man in Chicago." I shook my head, unable to process the magnitude of her words. A billionaire. Uncle Silas. Why tell me this? Ms. Gallagher stepped closer, angling her massive black umbrella to shield my face from the freezing rain. Because Fiona Silas had no wife and no children, he despised your mother and he loathed your sister. He watched from a distance as Beatrice manipulated this family. He watched your divorce proceedings very closely. He knew exactly what Preston and your mother were planning to do to you today. She reached into her sleek briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope stamped with a gold crest. Silas left behind an estate valued at $99 million in liquid assets, not including his private properties and vehicle collections. She looked me dead in the eye, the intensity of her gaze freezing me in place. And he left every single cent of it entirely to you. The shock of Patricia Gallagher's words paralyzed me entirely. $99 million. I stared at the silver-haired attorney while the freezing rain continued to assault my ruined belongings. Before I could process the absolute absurdity of her statement, she motioned to the open door of the sleek black town car. "Get in." "Fiona," she instructed, her voice slicing through the howling wind. "You are freezing to death out here, and we have a tremendous amount of work to do." I abandoned my shattered boxes on the driveway without a second glance. The interior of the town car was a sanctuary of immediate heat and soft, expensive leather. As the driver pulled away from the curb, I looked back at the sprawling suburban mansion that had been my home for 6 years. The lights in the massive dining room were still blazing brightly. I could see the silhouettes of Preston and Diana. They were still drinking their vintage champagne, completely unaware that a black car was carrying me away from my demise and directly toward their ultimate ruin. Ms. Gallagher handed me a thick, heated thermal blanket from a hidden compartment. We drove in complete silence for 45 minutes as the storm raged outside the tinted windows. We left the pristine suburban sprawl behind and entered the heart of Chicago. The car eventually turned onto a private tree-lined street in the Gold Coast neighborhood. It was an exclusive enclave of old money and historic architecture that made Preston's flashy new build look like cheap plastic imitation. We pulled up to massive wrought iron gates that swung open silently, acknowledging our arrival. The vehicle glided up a circular driveway and stopped in front of a breathtaking limestone mansion. It was a masterpiece of late 19th century architecture, covered in dark, dormant ivy, with massive arched windows glowing with warm, inviting light. This was Silas Whitmore's hidden fortress. The heavy front doors were opened by a discreet, uniformed staff member before we even reached the top step. Ms. Gallagher led me inside into a grand foyer paneled in dark mahogany and lined with priceless antique botanical prints. It was a bitter irony that the man my mother had constantly labeled a failure lived in a house that belonged in an architectural digest. Furthermore, it was decorated with the exact kind of historical plant studies she had always mocked me for dedicating my life to preserving. I was guided to a lavish guest bathroom where a set of dry, high-end clothes had been laid out for me. After stripping off my soaked, freezing garments and standing under a scalding shower, my mind finally began to thaw. I dressed in the tailored wool slacks and cashmere sweater provided, feeling the surreal heavy weight of the night pressing down on my shoulders. I had exactly $34 in my bank account, yet I was standing in a billionaire's hidden palace. I found Miss Gallagher waiting for me in a sprawling library. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of leather-bound books, and a massive marble fireplace roared with a welcoming fire. On the heavy oak desk between two wingback chairs sat a stack of legal documents and 2 cups of steaming black tea. "Sit down, Fiona," she instructed, sliding a thick leather-bound folder across the polished wood. I took a seat, wrapping my hands tightly around the hot teacup to stop their slight trembling. "You said Uncle Silas left everything to me?" I began, my voice finally steady. "But why? He never contacted me. I never even met him." "Silas preferred observing his family from the shadows," Ms. Gallagher replied, taking her own seat and folding her hands precisely on the desk. "He kept close tabs on every single member of the Whitmore family. He knew your mother Beatrice was raising you and your sister Diana to be superficial social climbers. He watched Diana become a ruthless replica of your mother. But he also watched you. He saw you reject their shallow ambitions to study botanical archiving. He saw you build your consulting firm with your own two hands. You were the only Whitmore who possessed his relentless work ethic and his deep respect for history. She opened the folder, revealing a stack of documents bearing my great-uncle's sharp, angular signature. But Silas did not just leave you his fortune out of simple admiration, Fiona. He left it to you because he needed an heir capable of executing his final piece of business. He needed someone with a fierce personal vendetta against the exact people who destroyed him decades ago. I leaned forward, my brow furrowing in confusion. Beatrice always said he drank away his inheritance and died in the streets. Beatrice is a pathological liar, Ms. Gallagher stated coldly. Silas was systematically robbed. 40 years ago, the Whitmore family held highly lucrative patents for innovative agricultural irrigation systems alongside vast tracts of undeveloped, environmentally protected land on the outskirts of the city. Silas was the rightful heir to those assets. But your mother, Beatrice, conspired with a young, ruthless corporate developer to forge documents and forcefully buy Silas out for pennies on the dollar. That developer used the stolen Whitmore patents to build a massive real estate empire while cutting Silas entirely out of the picture. My breath hitched as the puzzle pieces slammed into place. That developer was Preston's father. Ms. Gallagher nodded, her dark eyes gleaming sharply in the firelight. Exactly. Preston Caldwell's father built Caldwell Enterprises on the stolen bones of Silas Whitmore's legacy. Beatrice facilitated the massive theft in exchange for a huge cash payout, which she used to buy her status in Chicago society. Silas spent the last 40 years building a shadow empire of global commodities, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. He knew Preston was just as corrupt and greedy as his father. And when he saw Preston marry you, Silas knew the Caldwells were poisoning the Whitmore line a second time. I stared into the crackling fire, the sheer magnitude of the historical betrayal washing over me. My mother had not just sold me out to Preston today in family court. She had sold her own uncle out to Preston's father decades ago. Treachery and greed were woven directly into her DNA. Silas left you $99 million in liquid assets, this mansion, and a fleet of vehicles. Ms. Gallagher continued tapping her silver pen against the desk. However, there is a strict, non-negotiable condition attached to this inheritance. It is a condition designed to test your mettle and exact Silas's long-awaited justice. I looked her dead in the eye, feeling a new, dangerous energy replacing my despair. Tell me what I have to do. To inherit the estate, you must legally dismantle Caldwell Enterprises, Ms. Gallagher commanded, her voice dropping to a serious, lethal pitch. You must execute a hostile takeover and strip Preston of his company, his assets, and his title. Furthermore, you must repossess the Whitmore family estate where your mother and sister currently reside. Silas wants them formally evicted from the property bought with his stolen legacy. I felt a fierce, burning thrill ignite deep in my chest. You want me to completely destroy them? Legally and financially, yes, she confirmed without a hint of hesitation. You have exactly 6 months to complete this task. But there is a massive catch, Fiona. You cannot simply walk in there tomorrow and flash your newfound wealth. Silas insisted on absolute secrecy. If Preston, Beatrice, or Diana discover that you are a multimillionaire before the trap is fully sprung, you instantly forfeit the entire estate. I blinked, processing the severe restriction. I lose it all. Every single cent, Ms. Gallagher warned strictly. It will automatically be liquidated and donated to anonymous charities. Silas wanted them to be dismantled by the very woman they just discarded as worthless. They must believe you are utterly defeated. They must believe you are a penniless, mentally unstable failure, right up until the exact second you pull the rug out from under them. You must operate entirely from the shadows, just as Silas did. You must find the legal loophole that destroys Caldwell Enterprises using your own skills. My mind began racing with the strategic implications. I would have to play the part of the broken, impoverished ex-wife. I would have to let them mock me, humiliate me, and parade their stolen victories in my face, all while secretly holding the power to ruin their entire existence. It was a dangerous psychological game of chess, against three of the most manipulative people I had ever known. Can I use the trust funds to execute the takeover? I asked, my corporate instincts immediately kicking into high gear. Ms. Gallagher permitted a rare, genuine smile. I have been authorized to establish ghost holding companies on your behalf. You will have full access to the capital needed to acquire Preston's debt and legally maneuver against Caldwell Enterprises. But your personal lifestyle must reflect a woman who lost everything today. You will sleep in a cheap rundown apartment. You will work a low-level job. You will let them think they won. I thought about the freezing rain outside. I thought about the ruined boxes containing my life's work. I thought about Diana laughing on the porch sipping vintage champagne paid for with my stolen firm. They had thrown me to the wolves expecting me to die in the cold. They had no idea I was about to return as the leader of the pack. I reached across the heavy oak desk and took the gold-plated pen Ms. Gallagher was offering. I did not hesitate for a single second. I signed my name on the thick textured paper of my great-uncle's will, binding myself to his strict conditions and his deep thirst for vengeance. The contract is executed, Ms. Gallagher stated, gathering the documents and placing them securely back into her briefcase. Welcome to your new reality, Fiona Whitmore. We begin tomorrow. I stood up, feeling the intense warmth of the roaring fire against my back, but my heart was pure ice. Preston and Beatrice thought they had buried me today. They were about to learn that they had simply planted a seed and the harvest would be their absolute destruction. The very next morning, Patricia Gallagher and I initiated the illusion of my complete ruin. While I technically resided within the sprawling limestone walls of Silas's Gold Coast mansion, my public existence was carefully orchestrated to reflect absolute rock bottom. Using a fraction of the ghost holding company's funds, I signed a lease on a dilapidated studio apartment in the darkest corner of the city. The ceiling leaked, the radiator clanged, and the single window overlooked a brick wall. I routed my official mail there, ensuring any private investigator they hired would find exactly what they wanted to see: a broken, destitute woman clinging to the fringes of society. I secured a low-level position as a filing clerk at the Chicago Historical Registry. To the hiring manager, I was just a desperate, lonely woman with a background in botanical archiving, willing to accept minimum wage just to survive. To me, it was the absolute keys to the kingdom. Silas's notes had been very specific. The original land deeds proving the theft by Preston's father were buried deep within the city's ancient soil records, and foundational property blueprints stored below. The registry was a labyrinth of forgotten paperwork, a dusty graveyard of urban development history that no one had digitized. I spent 8 long hours a day in a windowless basement wearing a faded gray cardigan, breathing in the scent of decaying paper. I sifted through thousands of microfiche rolls and crumbling ledger books, hunting for the exact moment the Whitmore patents were illegally transferred to Caldwell Enterprises. I left the mansion before dawn, slipping out through the hidden subterranean service entrance to avoid the eager paparazzi that constantly stalked the Gold Coast. I traded the tailored cashmere Ms. Gallagher provided for threadbare thrift store jeans and heavily scuffed boots. By the time I arrived at the registry, my impoverished facade was utterly convincing. My supervisor, Arthur, barely glanced at me when he handed over stacks of disorganized zoning appeals from the 1970s. He had no idea the quiet woman sorting his files possessed a net worth capable of buying the entire city block. For weeks, I operated in the shadows. I cross-referenced the botanical soil samples my firm analyzed with the registry's property lines. Preston's massive new luxury development was built on a specific tract of land near the river. Silas's letters claimed that land was originally zoned as a protected botanical reserve, owned exclusively by the Whitmore Trust. If I could find the original deed, proving Preston's father had forged the environmental rezoning documents, Preston's entire $500 million project would be rendered a federal crime. I spent my lunch breaks eating cheap sandwiches in the dark archives, photographing every suspicious ledger entry with a hidden camera Ms. Gallagher had supplied. November arrived, bringing the bitter chill of the Chicago winter winds and the annual Whitmore Thanksgiving dinner. This was the moment I had to execute the next phase of the grand strategy. I needed to infiltrate the family gathering to lower their defenses entirely. I needed them to believe they had completely destroyed my spirit, so they would become careless with their secrets. I arrived at the Whitmore family estate, wearing a thin coat I purposely frayed. The massive iron gates swung open to reveal a driveway lined with luxury vehicles. I walked up the long path shivering perfectly, playing the part of the desperate beggar. When I knocked on the heavy oak doors, the housekeeper opened them with a look of sheer shock before stepping aside. The grand dining room was a spectacular display of excessive wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over a massive table draped in imported silk and covered in silver platters of extravagant food. Beatrice sat at the head of the table wearing a designer gown that cost more than my fake studio apartment's annual rent. Diana was seated to her right, glittering in expensive diamonds. When I stepped into the archway, the room fell silent. The clinking of silver forks against fine china ceased immediately. "Fiona," my mother said, her voice dropping instantly into a dangerous hiss. "What in God's name are you doing here? You were explicitly told you are no longer welcome on this property." I forced my shoulders to slump, looking down at my scuffed boots. I channeled every ounce of genuine exhaustion from working in the archives to make my voice sound utterly defeated. "Mom, please," I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on the imported rug. "I am sorry to interrupt. I have not eaten a real meal in 2 days. The heating in my apartment is broken. Preston took everything. I just need a small loan. Just $200 to buy groceries and pay the gas bill. I swear I will pay you back." Diana let out a sharp, malicious laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "A loan? Are you actually serious right now?" She turned to our mother, shaking her head in theatrical disbelief. "I told you she would come crawling back for handouts, Mom. Look at her. She looks like she just crawled out of a dumpster." Beatrice slowly stood up from her chair, her expression twisting into a mask of pure disgust. She walked toward me, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, until she was standing inches from my face. I could smell the expensive wine on her breath. "You have the absolute audacity to show up at my Thanksgiving dinner looking like a common vagrant," she spat, her voice low and furious. "After the embarrassment you put this family through, after you failed to maintain your marriage and your business, you think you can just walk in here and beg for cash." I kept my head bowed, biting the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. "Please, Mom," I pleaded, forcing my voice to tremble with fake emotion. "I am freezing. I am so hungry. Just a little help." My mother looked me up and down, her eyes raking over my frayed coat and cheap jeans with visible revulsion. "We do not reward failure in this family, Fiona. Giving you money would only enable your pathetic lack of ambition. You need to learn how the real world works." Diana chimed in from the table, slicing a piece of roasted turkey with deliberate, agonizing slowness. "Honestly, Fiona, it is depressing to even look at you. We are trying to have a nice, elegant family dinner, and your poverty is completely ruining the aesthetic of the room. You are bringing down the entire mood." Beatrice nodded in agreement, turning her back on me and walking back to her seat at the head of the table. "You are not eating in my dining room," she declared, picking up her wineglass. "I will not have my guests lose their appetites looking at your miserable state. If you are truly that desperate, you can go into the kitchen. The catering staff can give you some of the leftover scraps before they throw them out. But you are not to step foot in this dining room again. Do you understand me?" I stood there, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their cruelty. My own mother was forcing me to eat garbage in the kitchen like a stray dog, while she feasted in the very home that legally, according to Silas's trust, was about to belong to me. "I understand," I whispered, backing away slowly. "Thank you." I retreated into the bustling, massive kitchen. The catering staff looked at me with deep, uncomfortable pity, but they followed my mother's implicit orders. They set up a small folding chair in the corner near the industrial dishwashers and handed me a plastic plate filled with cold turkey and unseasoned vegetables. I sat in the harsh fluorescent lighting, listening to the muffled sounds of my family laughing and drinking vintage wine in the next room. I pulled a cheap plastic fork through the cold food, but I did not eat. Behind my exhausted expression, my mind was razor sharp. I reached into the pocket of my frayed coat and pressed the small hidden button on the digital audio recorder Ms. Gallagher had provided. I had captured every single vicious word Beatrice and Diana had just spoken. I had recorded their absolute lack of empathy and their blatant admission that they prioritized aesthetics over their own family's survival. They thought they were punishing me by putting me in the kitchen. They had no idea they had just given me unsupervised access to the nerve center of the house. Diana walked in carrying her empty dessert plate with a look of supreme satisfaction. She tossed her fine crystal plate into the large metal sink without breaking eye contact. "Enjoying your scraps, Fiona?" she asked sweetly. I looked up at her, offering a weak, pathetic smile. "Yes, Diana," I said softly. "I am getting exactly what I came for. This game was just beginning." Diana turned on her heel and strutted back into the dining room, leaving a trail of expensive perfume in her wake. I remained on my folding chair, carefully chewing a piece of cold turkey while the catering staff bustled around me. They avoided my gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamic playing out in front of them. After 10 minutes, a loud clinking of a silver spoon against crystal echoed from the adjacent room. It was Beatrice, commanding the attention of her wealthy guests. I stood up from my corner, wiping my hands on my cheap jeans. I crept toward the heavy wooden swinging doors that separated the kitchen from the formal dining area, and pushed one open just a fraction of an inch to see and hear clearly. Beatrice was standing at the head of the long table, her cheeks flushed with vintage wine in absolute triumph. She raised her glass high. "Family and friends," she announced, her voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "We have so much to be thankful for this year. But tonight is exceptionally special. Tonight we celebrate the glorious future of the Whitmore legacy. I am beyond thrilled to give the floor to my youngest daughter, Diana." Diana stood up, her diamond earrings catching the light from the massive chandelier overhead. She reached out and grabbed the hand of the man sitting next to her. It was Carter Caldwell, the younger brother of my ex-husband, Preston. Carter was 28 years old, a junior executive at Caldwell Enterprises, who mirrored his older brother in every arrogant gesture and tailored suit. Diana beamed a picture of perfect societal grace. "Carter and I have an announcement," she declared, her voice ringing with sheer delight. "We are officially engaged." The dining room erupted into applause and excited cheers. Beatrice clapped her hands together, tears of joy shining in her eyes. It was a terrifying realization. Diana marrying Carter meant the total unification of the Whitmore and Caldwell families. They were merging their stolen wealth, tightening their grip on the corporate real estate market, and sealing the legacy they had built on the bones of my great-uncle Silas. The betrayal went deeper than I had ever imagined. My mother was deliberately binding our family tree to the very men who had robbed us. "We are planning a massive spring wedding," Diana continued, raising her left hand to show off a staggering emerald-cut diamond ring that must have cost a small fortune. "And with Preston stepping up as the new CEO of Caldwell Enterprises, Carter will be taking over the acquisition division. We are going to build an empire together. The timing is absolutely perfect now that all the unfortunate baggage has been permanently removed from the picture." She did not say my name, but the implication hung heavily in the air. The guests laughed politely, raising their glasses to toast the newly engaged couple. Right on cue, the heavy oak front doors of the estate swung open. A rush of cold autumn air swept through the grand foyer, followed by the loud, confident footsteps of a man who believed he owned the world. Preston Caldwell strolled into the dining room, removing a custom-tailored cashmere overcoat and handing it carelessly to a waiting servant. He looked incredibly smug, his chest puffed out with the arrogance of a man who had recently crushed his only obstacle. "Sorry I am late," he announced, flashing a predatory smile at the room. "I was finalizing the permit approvals for our new $500 million riverfront development. The city just gave us the green light." The guests clapped again, mesmerized by his wealth and power. Preston walked over to Diana and Carter, clapping his younger brother on the shoulder. "Congratulations, little brother. Welcome to the winning team, Diana." You two are going to be a spectacular addition to the Caldwell legacy. Beatrice stood up and embraced Preston warmly, kissing him on both cheeks. We are so glad you could make it, Preston. This family would simply not be complete without our visionary CEO. Come sit down and have a drink. As Preston moved toward the head of the table, his eyes caught the slight movement of the swinging kitchen door. He stopped dead in his tracks, his predatory gaze locking directly onto me through the narrow gap. A cruel, dark amusement washed over his face. He changed his trajectory completely, abandoning his seat and walking straight toward the kitchen doors. He pushed the heavy door open wide, exposing me to the entire dining room. The conversation at the table died instantly as the guests turned to stare at the pathetic, disheveled woman standing in the fluorescent light of the catering kitchen. Well, look what we have here, Preston sneered, crossing his arms over his expensive suit. Fiona Whitmore in the flesh. I heard from Beatrice that you came crawling back for a handout. How the mighty have fallen. I forced myself to shrink back, clutching the edges of my frayed cardigan. I kept my eyes wide and fearful, playing the part of the broken ex-wife to absolute perfection. Hello, Preston? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I was just leaving. Oh, do not run away so fast, he mocked, stepping closer until he was towering over me. Diana and Beatrice joined him at the kitchen entrance, forming a barricade of hostility and designer clothing. Preston looked me up and down, clicking his tongue in fake sympathy. It is truly tragic, Fiona. You look terrible. You lost your house, you lost your mind, and you lost that pathetic little plant business. I heard you are living in a filthy studio apartment now. Is that true? I nodded slowly, staring at his polished Italian leather shoes. Yes. I cannot afford my heating bill. I just needed a small loan to get through the winter. Diana laughed, resting her head on Preston's shoulder. A loan. From who? Mom already told you we do not finance failures. If you want money, you have to earn it. But who on earth would hire someone with a documented history of severe mental instability? Your professional reputation is completely ruined. Preston raised a hand, silencing Diana with a theatrical sigh. Now, Diana, we must be charitable during the holidays. I am a generous man, and I hate to see my former wife freezing on the streets. He turned back to me, his eyes glinting with pure malicious intent. I actually have an open position at Caldwell Enterprises, Fiona. We just fired one of our night shift maintenance workers. The job pays minimum wage. You would be mopping floors, taking out the trash, and scrubbing the executive bathrooms from midnight until 6 in the morning. It is not glamorous, but it will keep your heat on. The room behind them was dead silent. The wealthy guests watched with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination as a millionaire CEO offered his former wife a job scrubbing his toilets. Beatrice smirked, taking a slow sip of her wine. It is a very generous offer, Fiona, she chimed in. You should take it. It builds character. It might finally teach you the value of hard work. My blood boiled with a rage so intense it threatened to consume me. They were trying to break my spirit entirely. They wanted to humiliate me on the deepest possible level, forcing me to clean up their garbage while they sat in glass towers built on my family's stolen legacy. They wanted to watch me scrub the floors of the very company Preston had stolen from me. But behind my wide, terrified eyes, my mind was racing with absolute triumph. Preston Caldwell had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his entire miserable life. Silas' hidden documents, the stolen Whitmore land deeds, and the financial records I needed to destroy, Caldwell Enterprises were locked away inside Preston corporate headquarters. I had been trying to figure out how to bypass his heavy corporate security for weeks. And now, blinded by his own ego and his desperate need to humiliate me, Preston was handing me the literal keys to the building. He was giving me unsupervised access to his executive offices for 6 hours every single night. I forced tears to well up in my eyes, letting one spill over my cheek. I looked up at Preston, making my lips tremble with fake desperation. Are you serious, Preston? I whimpered. You would really give me a job? I will do anything. I am so desperate. I promise I will work hard. Preston threw his head back and laughed, a booming, arrogant sound that echoed off the stainless steel kitchen appliances. Of course I am serious, Fiona. I love a good charity case. Report to the service entrance of the Caldwell building on Monday night at midnight. The head of maintenance will give you your uniform and a mop bucket. Do not be late or I will fire you on the spot. I bowed my head, letting the tears fall freely, now masking my lethal smile. Thank you, Preston. I whispered, my voice breaking perfectly. Thank you so much. I will not let you down. Beatrice waved her hand dismissively, turning away in disgust. Good. Now that your begging is finished, get out of my house, Fiona. Use the back door. The caterers need to bring out the dessert, and you are standing in their way. I turned around, pulling my cheap frayed coat tightly around my body, and walked toward the heavy metal service door at the back of the kitchen. I pushed it open, stepping out into the freezing November night air. The heavy door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the warmth and the sounds of their laughter. I stood alone in the dark alleyway behind the massive estate. The cold wind bit at my face, but I did not shiver. I reached into my pocket and turned off the digital audio recorder, saving the entire conversation. Preston, Beatrice, and Diana thought they had just forced me into a life of indentured servitude. They thought they had chained me to the bottom of their corporate ladder. They had no idea they had just invited a highly motivated, heavily funded ghost into their fortress. I took a deep breath of the crisp night air, feeling a powerful, dangerous calm settle over my entire body. I had the money, I had the motive, and now, thanks to Preston, monumental arrogance, I had the access. The hostile takeover of Caldwell Enterprises was officially underway. The following Monday night, I stood in the freezing alleyway behind the towering glass and steel monolith of Caldwell Enterprises. The wind whipped mercilessly through the canyon of skyscrapers, cutting through the thin nylon fabric of the oversized janitorial uniform I had been issued. I clutched a heavy mop bucket and a ring of master keys, waiting for the massive service elevator to descend. My hands were rough and raw, deliberately stripped of lotion and care to perfectly match my new fabricated identity. I was no longer Fiona Whitmore, the elite botanical consultant. I was Fiona, the broken, desperate charity case scrubbing toilets to survive. The elevator doors ground open, revealing the stark fluorescent lighting of the service corridors. I stepped inside, keeping my head bowed as a few late-working executives hurried past, ignoring my existence entirely. That was the absolute beauty of this disguise. A woman with a mop bucket is completely invisible in a corporate tower. They look right through you, seeing only the dirt you are paid to remove. For the first 3 nights, I played the role flawlessly. I scrubbed the marble floors of the grand lobby, emptied the trash cans in the bullpen, and wiped down the mirrors in the executive washrooms. I let Preston's security cameras record my meticulous, grueling labor. I let them see a woman utterly defeated, broken by the sheer physical exertion. But on the 4th night, the real work began. Ms. Gallagher had provided me with a collection of high-tech surveillance equipment purchased through the Ghost Holding Company. They were impossibly small devices, disguised as common office items. I started in Preston Corner office on the 60th floor. While wiping down his massive mahogany desk, I slipped a micro-audio transmitter behind the decorative base of his brass desk lamp. I planted a second device underneath the lip of the heavy conference table where he held his private board meetings. The transmitters were voice-activated and synced directly to a secure encrypted server Ms. Gallagher monitored. But audio was not enough. I needed hard financial evidence. Preston was arrogant, but he was not stupid enough to leave paper trails lying out in the open. His files were locked in a biometric safe, hidden behind a false wall panel in his private lounge. Fortunately, his arrogance was his ultimate downfall. Preston believed I was a mentally unstable failure incapable of grasping complex security systems. He had not bothered to change his secondary emergency passcode, the same 6-digit code he had used when we were married to secure our home alarm system. His father's birth date. At 3 a.m, while the security guards were occupied with their mandated rounds on the lower levels, I slipped into Preston Lounge. I bypassed the biometric scanner by entering the override code on the hidden keypad. The heavy steel door clicked open silently. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled out a specialized miniature camera Ms. Gallagher had hidden inside a hollowed-out cleaning spray bottle. I photographed everything. Hundreds of pages of confidential ledgers, board meeting minutes, and massive loan agreements. I worked with methodical precision, capturing the documents under the dim glow of my small flashlight. It took 4 consecutive nights of terrifying covert operations to photograph the entire archive. But what I uncovered was an absolute goldmine of corporate desperation. Preston was projecting the image of a titan to the Chicago elite, boasting about his new $500 million riverfront development. But the private ledgers told a completely different, horrifying story. The acquisition of my botanical firm had barely kept Caldwell Enterprises afloat. Preston was severely overleveraged. He had taken out massive predatory loans from shadow investors, using the entire Caldwell corporate portfolio as collateral. If the riverfront development faced even a minor delay, the interest rates would crush him. He was building a kingdom on a foundation of crumbling debt. The most damning piece of evidence was a master architectural blueprint hidden at the very bottom of the safe. I spread the massive document across the floor, tracing the property lines with a trembling finger. This was the exact plot of land Silas had warned me about. The $500 million luxury hotel and residential complex was being built directly on the stolen Whitmore Botanical Reserve. Preston was banking his entire corporate survival on developing a protected environmental zone his father had illegally seized decades ago. If the City Zoning Commission discovered that the land deeds were forged, Preston development would be instantly halted. The loans would default, and Caldwell Enterprises would be completely liquidated. The weakness was right in front of me, written in black ink and desperate financial projections. I just needed the historical proof from the registry to light the match. I carefully returned the blueprints to the safe, wiped down the keypad, and walked out of the office pushing my mop bucket. I smiled into the security camera at the end of the hall, playing the part of the exhausted janitor while holding the blueprints to Preston absolute destruction in my pocket. 3 hours later, I was sitting at a chipped wooden desk in the subterranean levels of the Chicago Historical Registry. The physical toll of working a grueling night shift followed immediately by a tedious day job should have left me completely incapacitated. Instead, raw adrenaline coursed through my veins. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the mountains of decaying cardboard boxes surrounding my workstation. My supervisor Arthur had tasked me with sorting a massive pile of municipal water records from the 1980s. It was the perfect mindless cover assignment. I smiled gratefully, accepted the boxes, and waited until his heavy footsteps echoed away down the concrete corridor. The second I was entirely alone, I pulled out my phone and opened the encrypted gallery containing the photographs of Preston blueprints. I zoomed in on the precise geographical coordinates of his $500 million riverfront development. I memorized the parcel numbers, the specific grid intersections, and the zoning codes listed on the margins of his architectural plans. Then I abandoned the water records and ventured deep into the restricted zone of the archives. This section of the registry was a veritable graveyard of forgotten urban history. Row upon row of towering steel shelves held the original topographical maps, ecological surveys, and property deeds of Chicago expansion era. This was my true element. Preston and Diana had ruthlessly mocked my career as a botanical archivist. My mother had publicly degraded my passion for historic landscapes, labeling it a filthy, embarrassing obsession with dirt. They were about to discover that my deep, intimate knowledge of that very dirt was the exact weapon required to orchestrate their absolute destruction. I hauled heavy leather-bound ledgers off the top shelves, coughing as decades of accumulated dust plumed into the stagnant air. I spread a massive yellowing topographical map across a wide viewing table, weighing down the curling corners with brass paperweights. I cross-referenced Preston coordinates with the historical city grid. According to Preston polished modern blueprints, his luxury high-rises were being anchored into a foundation of solid industrial bedrock. That was the narrative he had sold to his wealthy investors and the City Zoning Commission. But the ancient ecological surveys I was currently staring at told a drastically different story. I pulled the corresponding botanical soil records from a crumbling manila folder. My eyes scanned the dense typewritten pages, absorbing the chemical breakdowns and indigenous plant catalogs compiled over half a century ago. The land Preston was building on was not barren bedrock. It was a highly sensitive, incredibly rare glacial peat bog. The documents clearly detailed a unique subterranean ecosystem sustaining several species of endangered flora native only to the Lake Michigan basin. Because of this irreplaceable ecological value, the federal government had officially designated that specific parcel of land as a protected botanical reserve in 1979. The designation granted the property absolute immunity from commercial development. It was placed under the exclusive stewardship of the Whitmore Family Trust, guarded by strict federal preservation laws. I traced my finger over the original deed signed by my great-grandfather. Silas had been right. The land was an untouchable sanctuary. So how did Preston father manage to build an empire on top of it? I needed the bridge between the protected reserve and Caldwell Enterprises. I spent the next 4 hours frantically tearing through property transfer records from the early 1980s. My fingernails were stained black with age-old ink, and my eyes burned from reading faded microfilm, but I refused to stop. Finally, hidden in a mislabeled box of commercial tax audits, I found the smoking gun. It was a land transfer deed, dated November of 1982. I stared at the brittle paper, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The document claimed the federal protection had been legally revoked due to severe soil degradation. Attached to the deed was a supposedly official botanical survey stating the peat bog had dried up and the endangered plant life had entirely died off, rendering the land commercially viable. I scrutinized the attached botanical survey. As an expert in historical landscape preservation, I could spot the inconsistencies instantly. The soil pH levels recorded in the report were chemically impossible for that specific region. The seasonal timeline for the plant decay contradicted basic botanical science. The entire survey was a complete fabrication. It was a masterful piece of corporate fiction designed to bypass federal environmental laws. I looked down at the signatures authorizing the transfer. There, at the bottom of the page in bold black ink, was the signature of Preston father. And right beside it, authorizing the release of the Whitmore Trust, was the elegant sweeping signature of my mother, Beatrice Whitmore. The sheer gravity of their crime washed over me. Beatrice and the elder Caldwell had literally fabricated a fraudulent ecological collapse. They lied to the federal government, stripped the land of its protected status, and stole the deed right out from under Silas. My mother had sold our family's sacred heritage for a cash payout to fund her desperate climb up the social ladder. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. There is no statute of limitations on federal environmental fraud. By breaking ground on that massive riverfront development, Preston was not just building on stolen property, he was actively destroying a federally protected wetland. He was sinking millions of tons of concrete into a glacial bog, triggering a massive ecological violation. Preston's $500 million project was not just a poor financial risk. It was a massive ongoing federal crime. If federal prosecutors saw these documents, they would halt construction immediately. They would seize Preston's entire corporate portfolio, freeze his assets, and launch a criminal investigation. Caldwell Enterprises would be completely obliterated. I carefully slipped the forged transfer deed into my satchel. Beatrice was about to learn that the very dirt she despised would bury her completely forever. Slipping the forged transfer deed into my satchel, I left the subterranean archives of the Chicago Historical Registry with my heart pounding a steady, lethal rhythm. I had the smoking gun. Now I needed the financial ammunition to back it up. I hurried through the bitter cold of the Chicago evening, navigating the bustling streets until I reached the discreet, unmarked entrance of Gallagher and Hayes Estate Law. Patricia Gallagher was waiting for me in her glass-walled office overlooking the glittering city skyline. I placed the brittle yellow deed directly onto her immaculate desk. She adjusted her silver-rimmed glasses and scrutinized the document, tracing the forged signatures with a manicured finger. A slow, deeply dangerous smile spread across her face. This was the exact moment we shifted from gathering intelligence to active, unrestricted warfare. She poured 2 glasses of aged bourbon, sliding one across the desk to me. We toasted to Silas Whitmore's brilliance and to the absolute destruction of the people who had wronged him. It was the most satisfying drink I had ever tasted. The financial gears were officially in motion. There was absolutely no turning back now. We immediately initiated the financial takeover. Using the massive liquidity of Silas's $99 million estate, Ms. Gallagher established a highly insulated ghost holding company registered in Delaware. We named it Obsidian Holdings. It was a completely opaque corporate entity shielded by impenetrable layers of legal protection that made it utterly untraceable back to me, to the public, and to Preston Caldwell. Obsidian Holdings was simply an aggressive, highly capitalized venture capital firm looking to acquire distressed assets in the volatile Chicago real estate market. Preston was bleeding cash. His $500 million riverfront development was draining his operational funds dry, forcing him to take out massive high-interest loans from secondary lenders just to keep the construction crews working. Ms. Gallagher and her team of ruthless corporate attorneys moved with absolute surgical precision. Over the next 3 weeks, Obsidian Holdings approached Preston's shadow investors. We offered them immediate lucrative cash buyouts on Preston's debt. These private investors, eager to offload the massive risk associated with Caldwell Enterprises, practically handed the contracts over to us without a second thought. One by one, we quietly purchased every single promissory note, every line of credit, and every corporate bond tied to Preston's name. We bought the construction loans, we bought the equipment financing, we even bought the mortgage on his towering corporate headquarters. Within a single month, Caldwell Enterprises did not owe money to a dozen different banks. They owed 90% of their colossal crushing debt exclusively to Obsidian Holdings. They owed it to the exact woman Preston believed was currently scrubbing his toilets. The sheer irony was intensely satisfying. Every night at midnight, I still reported to the Caldwell building in my oversized janitorial uniform. I pushed a mop bucket across the pristine marble lobby, smiling submissively at the security guards. I emptied the trash cans in Preston's executive suite while he sat at his mahogany desk stressing over his mounting financial obligations. He would look right past me, barking frantic orders into his phone, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman wiping down his windows was now his sole and absolute creditor. But Preston was only one head of the snake. I needed to ensure my mother and sister were equally trapped in the snare. Beatrice was currently residing in the original Whitmore family estate, the very property she had used the stolen patent money to maintain for decades. Diana, eager to match Preston's lavish lifestyle following her engagement to Carter, had recently closed on a sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion in the North Shore. Both women lived far beyond their actual means, relying on heavily leveraged mortgages and the promise of Caldwell money to sustain their flawless country club facades. I directed Ms. Gallagher to pivot our acquisition strategy toward their personal assets. Banks are notoriously eager to sell off residential mortgages to holding companies to free up their own lending capital. Obsidian Holdings swept in and purchased the debt on the Whitmore family estate without raising a single red flag. A week later, we acquired the mortgage on Diana's new North Shore mansion. We bought their luxury car loans. We bought the debt on Beatrice's high-limit credit cards. We bought every single financial obligation they possessed, tying their entire existence directly to my bank accounts. They were completely oblivious to the impending disaster. Beatrice was busy picking out imported silk napkins for Diana's upcoming engagement gala, complaining loudly to her wealthy friends about the staggering cost of the floral arrangements. Diana was booking first-class tickets for a lavish pre-wedding vacation to Paris, swiping credit cards that I effectively owned. They were spending Silas's money living in houses funded by Silas's money, all while preparing to merge their stolen legacy with the Caldwell empire. They paraded around Chicago as if they owned the city. They slept soundly in their massive beds, believing they were the untouchable elite of Chicago society. They thought they had successfully discarded the only glitch in their perfect family portrait. They had no idea that their entire world was now a fragile house of cards resting directly in the palm of my hand. I held the deed that proved Preston was committing a massive federal crime. I owned the debt that could bankrupt his company overnight. I held the mortgages that could leave my mother and sister entirely homeless with the stroke of a pen. I was no longer just the scapegoat daughter or the discarded ex-wife. I was the silent architect of their absolute ruin. I had built the cage, loaded the weapon, and locked the doors. All I had to do now was wait for them to make their next move and spring the trap. Their greed blinded them to the reality that karma was finally coming to collect its long overdue debts. I arrived at my fake studio apartment early Tuesday morning, exhausted, but wired on adrenaline from my night at the Caldwell building. I pushed open the thin wooden door, the hinges screeching in protest, and immediately noticed a thick manila envelope shoved underneath the threshold. My name, Fiona Whitmore, was printed across the front in bold, aggressive lettering. The return address in the upper left corner made my stomach drop before I even broke the seal. Harrison and Vance Legal Associates, Preston's corporate attack dogs. I tore the envelope open, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted legal jargon. It was a formal cease and desist order accompanied by a summons to appear in civil court. Preston was suing me for violating a non-compete clause that had allegedly been buried deep within our divorce settlement. According to the lawsuit, he had somehow discovered that I was quietly taking on small private botanical consulting jobs to earn extra cash. A carefully planted rumor Ms. Gallagher and I had circulated to maintain my impoverished cover. Preston wasn't just trying to stop me from working. He was suing me for $500,000 in punitive damages, claiming my illegal freelancing was directly harming Caldwell Enterprises by poaching potential clients. It was a completely frivolous, legally baseless attack. My tiny side projects posed absolutely zero threat to his massive development firm. This wasn't a business decision. It was pure, unadulterated spite. He wanted to drive me into absolute crushing bankruptcy. He wanted to ensure I could never afford to feed myself, let alone rebuild my life. I sank onto the cheap, lumpy mattress of my studio, gripping the lawsuit tightly. The sheer cruelty of his action was breathtaking. He had already taken my home, my company, and my dignity. Now he wanted to salt the earth so nothing could ever grow again. But as the initial shock faded, a cold, sharp realization took its place. Preston's vicious retaliation was exactly the opening I needed. He was overplaying his hand, blinded by his own ego, assuming I was completely defenseless. I immediately called Ms. Gallagher. They took the bait, I told her, my voice steady. Preston is suing me for the freelance work. Excellent, she replied, the sound of keyboard clicking echoing through the phone. This lawsuit is his fatal error. By initiating legal action, he has formally tied you back into his corporate orbit. It provides us with the perfect pretext to interact with Beatrice and Diana. They will undoubtedly use this lawsuit as leverage against you. They want me desperate, I said, looking around the dismal studio apartment. They want me begging for mercy. Then you give them exactly what they want, Fiona. Play the victim flawlessly. Let them think this lawsuit is the final nail in your coffin. It will make them arrogant, and arrogant people make very public mistakes. I hung up the phone, a slow smile spreading across my face. Preston thought he was tightening the noose, but he had just handed me the rope I would use to hang him. The proxy war was about to escalate into direct, devastating contact. I spent the next 2 days amplifying the illusion of my despair. I left voicemails for Preston's lawyers, my voice trembling with fake panic, begging them to drop the suit. I deliberately maxed out the single low-limit credit card I kept for my cover identity, ensuring the declined transaction alerts would eventually filter back to Preston's financial monitors. I wanted them to believe I was spiraling, entirely broken by the weight of the legal threat. On Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Diana's name. I let it ring 3 times, building the suspense before answering with a hesitant, "Hello, Fiona?" Diana said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that failed to mask her underlying condescension. "Preston mentioned you've been causing some trouble for him professionally. A lawsuit. Really, Fiona? You always did have a talent for making things incredibly difficult for yourself." "Diana, please." I pleaded, injecting a note of genuine-sounding desperation into my voice. It's a misunderstanding. I was just trying to pay my rent. If he goes through with this lawsuit, I'll be completely bankrupt. I won't even be able to afford groceries. You have to talk to him. Please ask him to drop it. Diana sighed, a long theatrical sound of profound disappointment. You know, Mom and I were just talking about this. We hate seeing you struggle like this despite everything you've done. We want to help you, Fiona. We really do. But you have to prove that you're willing to make amends. You need to show us that you understand your place in this family now. The trap was closing exactly as Ms. Gallagher and I had anticipated. I'll do anything, I whispered, clutching the phone tightly. Just tell me what you need me to do. Come to the estate tomorrow at noon, Diana commanded, her tone abruptly shifting from fake concern to absolute authority. Mom and I have a proposition for you. If you agree to our terms, we'll make sure Preston drops the lawsuit entirely. Don't be late, Fiona. We don't have time for your usual dramatic delays. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, the fake desperation instantly vanishing from my face. They were summoning me back to the estate, the very place they had banished me from, to offer a humiliating deal. They thought they were reeling me in for the final kill. They had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the leash, and I was about to drag them all straight into the abyss. I arrived at the Whitmore estate exactly at noon the following day. The massive iron gates, the very same ones that had been slammed shut against me in the freezing rain, now swung open to admit my battered sedan. I parked at the far edge of the circular driveway, deliberately keeping a safe distance from my mother's pristine Mercedes and Diana's brand-new Porsche. I stepped out, pulling my frayed, oversized coat tightly around my shoulders. I hunched my posture, practicing the defeated, broken body language they expected to see. The estate looked immaculate, a sprawling testament to the wealth my mother had acquired by selling out our family legacy. I walked up the wide stone steps and knocked on the heavy oak doors. The housekeeper let me in with a tight, uncomfortable smile and directed me to the sunroom. I found Beatrice and Diana, lounging on plush cream-colored sofas, sipping sparkling water with lemon. The sunroom was a conservatory of glass and light overlooking the manicured winter gardens. Diana was holding a massive tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be event planning boards, while my mother flipped casually through a high-end fashion magazine. Neither of them bothered to stand or offer me a seat when I walked into the room. "You are late, Fiona," my mother said, not looking up from her magazine. "It is exactly noon, Mom," I replied, keeping my voice soft, submissive, and perfectly laced with anxiety. I left as soon as I could get off my shift. Diana finally looked up, her eyes dropping to my scuffed boots and worn coat. She wrinkled her nose in overt disgust. "Well, you are here now. Stand over there by the window. I do not want your dirty shoes ruining the Persian rug. We have a lot to cover, and frankly, I am already exhausted just looking at you." I obeyed, walking to the edge of the room and standing like an errant servant awaiting judgment. I folded my hands in front of me and lowered my gaze. "You said you had a proposition," I murmured. "You said you could get Preston to drop the lawsuit." My mother closed her magazine and placed it deliberately on the glass coffee table. She leaned back, crossing her legs, and fixed me with a stare of utter superiority. "Preston is furious, Fiona. He feels completely betrayed by your underhanded attempts to steal clients from his firm. He has every right to sue you into oblivion. He could take your wages, garnish your miserable little bank accounts, and leave you with absolute ruin for the rest of your natural life." I was just trying to survive, I pleaded, letting a slight tremor enter my voice. "I am barely making rent. Please, Mom, you have to stop him," Diana scoffed, setting her tablet down. "Preston is a powerful man, Fiona. He does not just drop lawsuits because someone asks nicely. However, Carter and I spoke with him last night. We reminded him that unfortunately, you are still technically blood. We told him that dragging you through a humiliating public trial might cast a slight shadow over my engagement gala next month. We convinced him to offer you a way out." "A way out?" I asked, widening my eyes in feigned desperation. "What does he want?" "I have absolutely nothing left to give him. He does not want your money," Diana snapped impatiently. "He wants you to learn a lesson, and Mom and I happen to agree with him. We have decided to offer you an opportunity to earn your way back into the family's good graces, an opportunity to prove that you are not entirely useless. My mother picked up the thread, her voice dropping into a patronizing, dictatorial cadence. Diana's engagement gala is exactly 4 weeks away. It will be the social event of the season. We are expecting over 500 guests, including the mayor, several state senators, and the most prominent real estate developers in the Midwest. The gala is being hosted at Preston's newly unveiled flagship luxury hotel downtown. It must be absolutely flawless. She paused, letting the weight of the event hang in the air before delivering the killing blow. Our primary floral designer had a sudden medical emergency and had to withdraw from the contract. To hire a replacement at this late stage would cost an astronomical amount, and the vendors available are simply not up to my standard. Therefore, you are going to design, source, and install all the floral arrangements for the entire gala. I stared at them, letting my jaw drop slightly to simulate sheer panic. All the floral arrangements for a 500-guest gala. Mom, that is a massive undertaking. That is weeks of grueling manual labor sourcing thousands of rare flowers, building towering centerpieces, and orchestrating a team of installers. You will not have a team, Diana corrected sharply, a cruel, vindictive smile spreading across her face. You will do it completely single-handedly. You will source the flowers, build the centerpieces, transport them to the hotel, and set up the entire ballroom yourself. You will work through the night if you have to, and you will do it entirely for free. For free, I whispered, allowing a perfectly timed tear to well up in my eye. Diana, I cannot afford to buy thousands of exotic flowers. The wholesale cost alone would be tens of thousands of dollars. I have $30 in my bank account. I cannot finance your gala. That is not our problem, my mother stated coldly. You can take out a high-interest loan. You can beg your little freelance clients for advances. You can max out credit cards. We do not care how you finance it, Fiona. That is your burden to bear. You will supply 20 massive entrance arrangements, 50 lavish table centerpieces featuring imported white orchids and rare hydrangeas, and a complete floral archway for the main stage. Diana leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with malice. And do not think you can show up during the actual party to mingle. You will use the service elevators. You will not speak to my wealthy guests. You will set up the displays like the hired help you are, and you will leave through the back door before the first guest arrives. I stood perfectly still, absorbing the sheer, staggering audacity of their extortion. They were demanding that a woman they believed to be destitute and mentally unstable take on tens of thousands of dollars in new debt and perform backbreaking physical labor purely to save them money on a luxury party. They were leveraging a frivolous, ruinous lawsuit to force me into unpaid indentured servitude. This is an ultimatum, Fiona. My mother continued, her tone completely devoid of maternal affection. If you complete this task to our exact specifications, and if the gala looks spectacular, I will personally guarantee that Preston drops the lawsuit the very next morning. You will be free from the legal threat, and you will have finally demonstrated a shred of actual value to this family. Consider it your penance for being such a monumental disappointment. Diana picked up her tablet again, dismissing my distress entirely. Think of it as a character-building exercise. You always loved playing in the dirt. Now you get to do it for a cause that actually matters. My social debut. And if you refuse or if you fail to deliver perfection, Preston will proceed with the lawsuit. He will drag you into court, ruin you completely, and make sure you end up sleeping on a park bench by Christmas. I looked from my sister to my mother. Their faces were impassive, entirely convinced of their own absolute superiority. They thought they had backed me into a corner with no escape. They believed they were forcing me to grovel, to bleed my own meager resources dry, just to appease their insatiable vanity. But behind my tear-filled eyes and trembling hands, my mind was running through the tactical implications at lightning speed. To design and install the floral arrangements for a 500-guest gala, I would need unrestricted, unlimited access to the event venue for at least 48 hours prior to the party. I would need access to the service elevators, the loading docks, the ballroom infrastructure, and the staging areas. And the venue was Preston Caldwell's newly unveiled flagship luxury hotel, the exact epicenter of his new corporate empire, the crown jewel of the stolen Whitmore development project. My mother and sister were not just giving me a chore, they were handing me the ultimate Trojan horse. They were providing me with a legitimate, unquestionable reason to be inside Preston's highly secure building on the most important night of his professional career, armed with massive crates, structural equipment, and rolling carts that security would never bother to inspect. They were literally rolling out the red carpet for their own total annihilation. I looked down at my hands, squeezing them together to hide the fierce, uncontrollable surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. The ghost holding company Obsidian Holdings had more than enough capital to quietly fund the wholesale flower purchases without raising a single red flag. I could easily procure the white orchids and rare hydrangeas Diana demanded. I could build her the most beautiful, breathtaking floral archway Chicago had ever seen, because that archway was going to frame the exact stage where I would execute the hostile takeover. The centerpieces would decorate the tables where Preston's elite investors would sit when I projected the evidence of his federal crimes onto the ballroom walls. The flowers were merely the wrapping paper for the bomb I was about to detonate. I took a deep, shuddering breath, playing the role of the broken, defeated victim one last time. I wiped the fake tear from my cheek and looked up at my mother and sister. "Okay," I whispered, my voice sounding hollow and crushed. "I will do it. I will find a way to pay for the flowers. I will design the centerpieces. I will do all the labor myself for free. Just please promise me that Preston will drop the lawsuit. I cannot survive a trial." My mother smiled, a cold, victorious curving of her lips. "I am glad to see you are finally learning your place, Fiona. Do not disappoint us. We expect absolute perfection. You will have it," I promised, bowing my head to hide my chilling, predatory smile. "It will be a night no one in this family will ever forget." I walked out of the bright sunroom, leaving my mother and sister to their sparkling water and their deep delusions of absolute control. The heavy oak front doors of the estate shut behind me for what I knew would be the very last time. I climbed into my battered sedan, gripping the steering wheel with hands that were finally perfectly steady. I did not drive to my fake studio apartment. I drove straight to Gallagher and Hayes Estate Law. Ms. Gallagher steepled her fingers, a sharp glint of predatory approval in her eyes. "They have handed you the keys to the Castle, Fiona. A vendor with a massive installation contract requires unrestricted access to the venue. You will have clearance for the loading docks, the service corridors, and the main ballroom floors days before the actual event. We can bypass Caldwell Enterprise security entirely." We immediately mobilized the resources of Obsidian Holdings. Working through a dummy corporation, we quietly purchased tens of thousands of imported white orchids, rare hydrangeas, and cascading emerald greenery. We rented an unmarked commercial delivery truck and secured a temporary warehouse to assemble the structural foundations for the centerpieces. For 3 grueling weeks, I worked around the clock, combining the exhaustive physical labor of floral design with the precise, meticulous planning of a corporate assassin. I did not sleep. I operated on pure adrenaline and the intoxicating promise of absolute justice. Exactly 48 hours before the massive engagement gala, I pulled the heavily loaded rented commercial box truck into the subterranean loading dock of the Caldwell Grand Hotel. It was a soaring monument to Preston ego, a glittering skyscraper of glass and steel built on the stolen Whitmore Botanical Reserve. The security team at the loading bay barely glanced at me. I was wearing faded denim overalls, a dirty baseball cap pulled low over my face, and thick canvas work gloves. I was just the hired help bringing in the flowers. They waved me through, giving me a temporary vendor keycard that granted me access to every service elevator and utility corridor in the building. Over the next 2 days, I transformed the massive main ballroom. I unloaded heavy wooden crates and assembled 50 lavish towering centerpieces that cascaded perfectly over the velvet-draped tables. I constructed a breathtaking floral archway framing the main stage where Diana and Carter would soon stand to celebrate their stolen wealth. It was a masterpiece of botanical design, ironically funded by the very billionaire they despised. But the flowers were simply a gorgeous aromatic smokescreen. My true objective lay directly behind the main ballroom stage. Under the guise of needing to secure the heavy floral archway to the structural beams, I slipped past the velvet curtains and entered the hotel's central audiovisual control room. The technicians were on their lunch break, leaving the massive digital mixing boards and projection servers completely unattended. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady. I pulled a sleek encrypted flash drive from the bottom of my toolbox. Ms. Gallagher had hired top-tier corporate cybersecurity experts to format the drive. I plugged it directly into the primary input port of the hotel master projection server. The system recognized the device instantly. With a few swift keystrokes, I uploaded our entire digital arsenal into the hotel mainframe. First, I loaded the crisp, clear audio recording of my mother and sister from the estate sunroom, actively admitting to lying to the divorce judge and plotting to steal my trust fund. Next, I uploaded the high-resolution scans of the original ecological surveys and the forged land transfer deeds, proving Preston $500 million riverfront development was a massive federal crime. Finally, I uploaded the heavily redacted financial documents from Obsidian Holdings, proving that my ghost company currently owned 90% of Preston corporate debt and the mortgages on both my mother and sister homes. I did not just load the files, I set up an automated bypass protocol. I synced the hotel master projector controls directly to a secure application on my personal cell phone. Once I triggered the sequence from the ballroom floor, the hotel system would lock out all manual overrides. The technicians would be completely locked out of their own control boards. Preston's security guards would not be able to shut the screens off or cut the audio. The only way to stop the presentation would be to physically sever the main power lines to the entire building. I carefully removed the flash drive, slipped it back into my toolbox, and returned to the ballroom floor before the technicians returned. I spent the final hours meticulously adjusting the white orchids on the main stage, ensuring every single petal was flawless. The trap was now fully armed and completely invisible, disguised beneath tens of thousands of dollars worth of rare, breathtaking flowers. As the sun began to set over the Chicago skyline, casting long golden shadows across the glittering ballroom, the venue manager approached me. He wrinkled his nose at my dirt-stained overalls. "The guests will be arriving in an hour," he snapped. "You need to clear your equipment and exit through the service doors immediately. Mr. Caldwell does not want vendors loitering in the hallways." I bowed my head respectfully, wiping a smudge of dirt from my cheek. "Of course, sir," I said, my voice meek and compliant. "I am leaving right now." I pushed my empty metal utility cart toward the service elevators, leaving the pristine ballroom behind. I took the elevator down to the subterranean parking garage, loaded my cart into the back of the rented box truck, and locked the doors. But I did not drive away. Instead, I walked to the private executive locker rooms I had located on the ground floor. I stripped off the dirty denim overalls, the canvas gloves, and the baseball cap, tossing them into the trash can. I washed my face and changed my old dirty clothes. The emerald silk of my custom-tailored gown slipped over my skin, banishing the filthy, oversized janitorial uniform to the trash can forever. I stepped out of the private executive locker room and left the ghost of the broken ex-wife behind. I paired the designer gown flown in directly from Milan and purchased discreetly through Obsidian Holdings with vintage diamond drop earrings and a matching emerald necklace from Silas's personal vault. My hair was swept up into a flawless, elegant style, and my makeup was sharp, pristine, and completely unapologetic. I looked like a woman who owned the world, because tonight I absolutely did. I walked down the marble hallway toward the grand ballroom, my heels clicking with lethal precision. The heavy oak doors were propped open, allowing the sounds of a live jazz quartet and the clinking of expensive crystal to drift into the corridor. I slipped silently into the back of the room, blending into the shadows of the mezzanine to observe the final moments of their delusional paradise. The ballroom was a spectacular display of unbridled extravagance. 500 of Chicago's most elite socialites, politicians, and corporate titans filled the space. They mingled beneath the towering floral arrangements I had built with my own hands. At the absolute center of the room, commanding the largest table, sat my mother, Beatrice, and my sister, Diana. They were holding court surrounded by wealthy wives and curious investors. I moved closer, staying just out of their direct line of sight, allowing their haughty voices to reach me over the music. Diana was waving her massive engagement ring in the air, basking in the attention. "The floral archway is simply stunning," one of the senator's wives gushed, touching a cascading white orchid. "Who is your designer, Diana?" Diana let out a sharp, musical laugh that grated against my nerves. "Oh, we did not hire a professional designer," she boasted, her voice deliberately loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "My older sister Fiona actually put this all together. You know, she had a terrible mental breakdown recently and lost everything in her divorce. She is completely destitute now, living in some awful slum. Mom and I took pity on her and gave her this little charity project to keep her off the streets." Beatrice nodded, sipping her vintage champagne with an expression of profound martyrdom. "It has been incredibly taxing on the family," she sighed, placing a manicured hand over her heart. "But we believe in giving second chances to those less fortunate. We had to force Preston to let her use the service entrance, of course. We could not risk her having one of her little episodes in front of polite society, but she did an adequate job with the flowers considering her fragile condition." The women at the table murmured in sympathetic awe, praising my mother and sister for their outstanding generosity. I stood in the shadows, a cold, lethal smile spreading across my lips. They were gorging themselves on a narrative of their own supreme benevolence, completely blind to the guillotine hanging directly over their heads. The jazz quartet suddenly stopped playing. A sharp tapping of a silver spoon against a crystal glass echoed through the massive ballroom. Every eye turned toward the front of the room. Preston Caldwell stepped up onto the main stage, standing directly beneath the breathtaking floral archway I had engineered. He wore a bespoke tuxedo and the arrogant, satisfied grin of a man who believed he was utterly invincible. He adjusted the microphone and looked out over the sea of wealthy investors. "Thank you all for joining us on this magnificent evening," Preston began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Tonight, we are not just celebrating the engagement of my brilliant brother Carter to the stunning Diana Whitmore. We are celebrating the absolute triumph of Caldwell Enterprises." The crowd erupted into polite applause. Preston held up a hand, soaking in their adoration before continuing. "Today, our board of directors officially named me the new Chief Executive Officer of Caldwell Enterprises. But that is just the beginning. I am thrilled to announce that the City Zoning Commission has fully approved our monumental riverfront project. Tomorrow morning, we break ground on a $500 million luxury development. It is a project built on solid bedrock and a foundation of unwavering family legacy. We are transforming the Chicago skyline forever." The ballroom exploded into thunderous applause and cheers. Beatrice and Diana stood up from their table, clapping enthusiastically and beaming with stolen pride. Preston raised his champagne glass high, preparing to deliver his final toast. This was the moment. The trap was fully primed. I stepped out of the shadows of the mezzanine and walked directly into the blinding light of the ballroom. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured gait of an apex predator circling its trapped prey. The crowd at the back of the room parted automatically, instinctively reacting to the sheer authority radiating from my presence. The emerald silk of my gown caught the light from the chandeliers, shimmering brilliantly as I moved down the center aisle. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd like a rising tide. People nudged each other, turning their heads to stare at the stunning woman interrupting the CEO's grand speech. I kept my eyes locked dead onto Preston's face. He was mid-sentence praising his own business acumen when his gaze finally tracked the movement in the crowd. His voice faltered. His arrogant smile froze, completely stiffening into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He lowered his champagne glass, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the stem. Beatrice and Diana turned to follow his stare. When my mother saw me, the crystal champagne flute slipped directly from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. Diana gasped audibly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. They stared at me as if a ghost had just materialized from the floorboards. They had expected a broken, dirty janitor cowering by the service elevators. Instead, they were looking at a queen. I did not stop until I reached the steps of the main stage. I walked up the stairs, my heels clicking against the polished wood, and stopped right beside Preston. The entire ballroom of 500 elite guests was now dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. I calmly reached out and took the microphone directly from Preston's paralyzed hand. He was too stunned to even resist. "Thank you, Preston, for that incredibly moving piece of absolute fiction," I said, my voice echoing crystal clear through the massive room. I turned to face the crowd, offering a bright, razor-sharp smile. "Good evening, everyone. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Fiona Whitmore. I am the woman Diana and Beatrice were just describing as their pathetic charity case. And I am the woman Preston forced into bankruptcy, claiming I was mentally unfit to run a business." The gasps from the audience were immediate and audible. Preston finally snapped out of his shock, his face flushing a deep, furious red. He stepped toward me, reaching for the microphone. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" he hissed, his voice low and vicious. "You look like you stole that dress from a client. Get off my stage right now before I have you arrested for trespassing." I took a deliberate step back, keeping the microphone safely out of his reach. "I am exactly where I belong." "Preston," I replied, my voice amplified for every single investor in the room to hear, "I am just providing some much-needed transparency to your shareholders." Preston's eyes darted around the room, realizing his entire network of elite peers was watching this humiliation unfold. His ego could not handle the public challenge. He turned toward the perimeter of the ballroom and snapped his fingers violently at the head of his private security detail. "Guards!" he barked, his voice cracking with rage. "Remove this crazy woman from the premises immediately. Drag her out the back door and call the police. I want her charged with criminal trespassing and harassment." 6 heavily armed security guards wearing crisp black suits and earpieces stepped forward from the edges of the ballroom. Beatrice let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief from her table. "Thank goodness," she announced to her friends. "The poor girl has completely lost her grip on reality. This is exactly why we had to take her business away." Diana nodded frantically. "She is having a psychotic break. Just ignore her, everyone. The guards will handle it." I stood perfectly still on the stage, watching the 6 large men march down the center aisle. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I simply waited. The guards reached the base of the stage and walked up the steps. But they did not grab my arms. They did not reach for my wrists. Instead, they marched past Preston and formed a protective perimeter directly around me, facing the audience with their hands clasped firmly in front of them. They created a physical wall between me and my furious ex-husband. Preston stared at them, his jaw dropping open in utter disbelief. "What is wrong with you?" he screamed, losing his polished corporate facade entirely. "I said grab her. Throw her out of my building right now. Do your damn jobs." The head of the security detail slowly turned his head to look at Preston. His expression was completely blank, entirely devoid of respect for the man screaming at him. "I am sorry, sir," the head guard said, his deep voice carrying without the need for a microphone. "We cannot do that." Preston's face turned purple with rage. "What do you mean you cannot do that? I pay your salaries. I am the CEO of this company. I am giving you a direct order to remove this trespassing lunatic." The guard shook his head slowly, stepping closer to me to reinforce the protective barrier. "Actually, sir, you do not pay our salaries anymore. Our private security contract was purchased in full last week by a private venture capital firm. We work exclusively for Obsidian Holdings now." Preston blinked, stepping back as if he had been physically struck. Obsidian Holdings, the firm that bought up his massive commercial debt. He looked at the guard and then slowly turned his horrified gaze back to me. The guard gestured respectfully in my direction. "And Ms. Whitmore is the sole proprietor of Obsidian Holdings. She is our boss, sir, and she gave us strict instructions that no one is to touch her tonight." The revelation dropped over the ballroom like a massive suffocating blanket. The wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites began murmuring frantically among themselves, the pieces of the puzzle rapidly coming together. Beatrice sank slowly back into her chair, her face draining of all color until she looked like a ghost. Diana gripped the edge of the table, her diamond ring digging into the tablecloth, staring at me with a look of absolute sheer terror. I raised the microphone back to my lips, a cold, triumphant smile locked onto my face. "Now that we have established exactly who is in charge of this building," I said, staring directly into Preston's panicked eyes, "let us talk about that $500 million riverfront development you were just bragging about. Because, Preston, you are not a visionary CEO. You are a federal criminal, and I brought the receipts to prove it." I reached into the hidden pocket of my silk gown and pulled out my cell phone. With a single deliberate swipe across the screen, I activated the automated bypass protocol I had installed 48 hours ago. Instantly, the ambient lighting in the grand ballroom dimmed to a cinematic low. The smooth jazz music abruptly cut off. High above us, 3 massive motorized projection screens descended simultaneously from the vaulted ceiling, locking into place with a heavy mechanical thud. Preston lunged toward the stage edge, screaming at the audiovisual booth visible in the glass balcony above. "Cut the power," he roared, his face twisting in panic. "Turn those screens off, right now." The lead technician leaned over the balcony railing, his hands raised in a gesture of absolute surrender. "I cannot do anything, Mr. Caldwell," he yelled back over the murmuring crowd. "The entire system is locked out. Someone has hijacked the mainframe." I turned back to the audience, my voice projecting with chilling clarity. "Please direct your attention to the screens, ladies and gentlemen. I promised you transparency regarding Caldwell Enterprises and the Whitmore family legacy. Let us begin with the foundation of their current wealth: the perjury committed in family court." I tapped my phone screen. The massive speakers surrounding the ballroom crackled to life. Suddenly, the haughty, unmistakable voices of my mother and sister echoed through the silent venue. It was the crystal-clear audio I had recorded while sitting on a folding chair in their catering kitchen. Diana's recorded voice dripped with malicious satisfaction. "I told you she would come crawling back for handouts, Mom. Look at her. She looks like she just crawled out of a dumpster." Then Beatrice's voice filled the room, slurred slightly by vintage wine, but laced with pure venom. "You are a massive disappointment, Fiona. You lack vision. You lack drive. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is for me to answer questions about you at the country club?" The guests in the ballroom shifted uncomfortably, but the real shock was yet to come. I triggered the next audio file, the conversation I had captured outside the sunroom just weeks ago. Diana's voice echoed again, sharp and calculated. "Mom, she does not know about the party. We did not invite her. What about the trust fund?" Beatrice's recorded voice answered smoothly. "Yes, I spoke to the lawyer last week. Since she has been out of contact for so long, and there is documentation of her dropping out and cutting ties, we should be able to claim her portion was forfeited. It will take some time, but he is confident we can make it work. She made her choice when she dropped out. She chose to throw her life away." A collective gasp rippled through the audience of 500 elite guests. Mayors, senators, and corporate titans turned their heads to stare directly at the table where Beatrice and Diana sat. My mother had gone completely rigid, her face drained of all blood. Diana was shaking her hands, covering her mouth, as she realized her private plotting was now public record. I lowered the phone and looked directly at them. "That is right," I announced. "My mother and sister conspired to have me declared mentally unstable so Preston could absorb my lucrative botanical consulting firm. Then they planned to use my forced destitution to steal a trust fund established by my great-uncle. They sold my sanity to buy their social status. But the theft of my company is merely a footnote compared to the staggering fraud Caldwell Enterprises is committing." At this very second, I continued pivoting my attention back to Preston. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides, trapped on his own stage by my wall of security guards. I tapped my screen again. The audio cut off, replaced by high-resolution images flashing across the 3 massive screens. On the left appeared a brittle yellowing document, an original land deed from 1979. On the right appeared Preston's sleek modern blueprints for his $500 million riverfront luxury development. Take a close look at those coordinates, I instructed the crowd, my voice ringing with the absolute authority of a botanical archivist. Preston has pitched his new riverfront project as an architectural marvel built on solid industrial bedrock. But the document on the left is the original federal ecological survey of that exact parcel of land. I zoomed in on the ancient text, highlighting the critical paragraphs in bright red. That land is not barren bedrock. It is a highly sensitive, incredibly rare glacial peat bog, sustaining several species of endangered flora native only to the Lake Michigan basin. Because of its irreplaceable ecological value, the federal government officially designated it as a protected botanical reserve in 1979. It was placed under the exclusive, untouchable stewardship of the Whitmore Family Trust. Whispers broke out among the investors in the room. Several men in expensive suits pulled out their phones, rapidly typing messages to their legal teams. Preston took a desperate step forward. "Do not listen to her," he shouted, his voice cracking. The land was legally rezoned decades ago. The environmental protections were lifted. I smiled, a sharp, lethal expression that stopped him dead in his tracks. I tapped my phone, bringing up the forged land transfer deed from 1982. The protection was lifted because your father and my mother fabricated a fraudulent ecological collapse. I corrected, my voice slicing through his lies. They forged a botanical survey claiming the peat bog had dried up and the endangered plant life had died off. They lied to the federal government, stripped the land of its protected status, and stole the deed from my great-uncle Silas Whitmore. Look at the signatures at the bottom of that document. The camera zoomed in on the bottom of the screen, magnifying the bold signatures of the elder Caldwell and Beatrice Whitmore. The entire room saw the undeniable proof of their historical fraud. "There is no statute of limitations on federal environmental fraud," I declared, stepping closer to Preston so he could not escape my gaze. By breaking ground on that massive riverfront development today, Preston is not just building on stolen property. He is actively sinking millions of tons of concrete into a federally protected wetland. He is triggering a massive ongoing ecological violation. The second federal prosecutors see these documents, which my legal team has already forwarded to the Department of Justice, they will halt construction permanently. The permits are void. The project is dead. Caldwell Enterprises is committing a massive federal crime. Absolute chaos erupted in the ballroom. Two state senators sitting near the front immediately stood up and walked briskly toward the exits, eager to distance themselves from a pending federal indictment. The lead investors, who had just poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Preston, doomed project, began shouting, demanding answers. Preston looked wildly around the room, watching his empire disintegrate before his very eyes. He turned back to me, his chest heaving. "You crazy, vindictive woman," he hissed. "Even if that project fails, Caldwell Enterprises is a multi-billion-dollar firm. We will survive this. We will crush you in court for defamation." I let out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed through the microphone. "Preston, you truly have no idea how deep this grave goes, do you?" I tapped my screen for the final time. The historical deeds vanished from the massive screens, replaced by heavily redacted but undeniable financial portfolios. The heading at the top of the documents read, "Obsidian Holdings," in stark black letters. "While you were busy suing me for trying to freelance and forcing me to design your floral arrangements for free, I was busy making investments," I explained smoothly. "The acquisition of my firm barely kept you afloat. Your riverfront development drained your operational funds dry, forcing you to take out massive high-interest loans from shadow investors just to keep the lights on." Preston's eyes darted to the screens, recognizing the private financial ledgers he thought were secured in his biometric safe. "How did you get those?" He choked out, his arrogant facade completely shattered. "I am the janitor you hired to scrub your executive bathrooms, Preston," I reminded him, my voice dripping with cold satisfaction. "You gave me unsupervised access to your offices every night from midnight until 6 in the morning. And while I was emptying your trash cans, I was also photographing your private safe." I pointed to the screens where the debt transfer records were displayed. Over the past month, a private venture capital firm named Obsidian Holdings approached every single one of your shadow investors. We offered them lucrative cash buyouts on your mounting debt. They practically handed the contracts over to us. One by one, we quietly purchased every single promissory note, every line of credit, and every corporate bond tied to your name. We bought your construction loans. We bought your equipment financing. We even bought the mortgage on this very hotel we are standing inside. I paused, letting the absolute gravity of the situation settle over him. Caldwell Enterprises does not owe money to a dozen different banks anymore, Preston. You owe 90% of your colossal crushing debt exclusively to Obsidian Holdings. And as I established earlier tonight, I am the sole proprietor of Obsidian Holdings. I turned my attention to the table where Beatrice and Diana were sitting frozen in absolute terror. And it is not just Preston corporate debt I own, I continued, my voice ringing with total authority. Diana, that sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion you just bought in the North Shore. Obsidian Holdings purchased the mortgage last week. Beatrice, the original Whitmore family estate you have been living in using stolen legacy money. I own that mortgage too. I walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at my mother and sister, who were now trembling uncontrollably. You thought you could force me into indentured servitude by leveraging a frivolous lawsuit? I said, my eyes locked onto theirs. You thought you could make me beg for scraps in your kitchen while you lived like queens. But you have been spending my money living in houses funded by my wealth swiping credit cards that I legally control. Every single financial obligation you possess is tied directly to my bank accounts. You are not the elite of Chicago society. You are my debtors. The ballroom was dead silent save for the sound of Diana beginning to quietly hyperventilate. The wealthy guests who had been mocking me just 30 minutes prior now looked at me with a mixture of profound awe and absolute terror. I had not just exposed their lies, I had methodically, legally, and financially stripped them of everything they owned. I had built a cage around them using their own greed and arrogance as the bars, and now the doors were permanently locked. Preston stood on the stage, his chest heaving as he stared at the financial ledgers glowing on the massive screens above us. His arrogant mind simply refused to process the reality of his total defeat. "This is impossible," he stammered, his voice echoing weakly through the silent ballroom. "You do not have the capital to fund an entity like Obsidian Holdings. You are a broke, unemployed consultant. You have $34 in your bank account. I made sure of it. I stood in front of a judge and had your assets completely frozen. There is absolutely no way you could afford to buy out my shadow investors, let alone acquire the mounting debt of my entire corporate portfolio. This is a bluff. It has to be a bluff." He pointed a trembling finger at the projection screens, desperately trying to convince the silent, staring crowd that I was orchestrating an elaborate hoax. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, closing the distance until we were standing mere inches apart. "You only froze the accounts you knew about Preston," I replied, my voice projecting with lethal calm through the microphone. "You and my mother thought you erased Silas Whitmore from history when you stole his protected land. But Silas spent the last 40 years building a global commodities empire in the shadows entirely out of your sight. He passed away the exact same week you threw me out into the freezing rain and seized my botanical firm. And he left his entire estate, $99 million in unrestricted liquid assets, exclusively to me." A collective gasp rippled through the audience of 500 elite guests. The staggering number hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Preston's face drained of all remaining color. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. I was not just a disgruntled ex-wife seeking petty revenge. I was a billionaire sole heir armed with a fortune massive enough to swallow his entire company whole without making a single dent in my ledger. With that kind of capital, buying your debt was remarkably easy. I continued, turning gracefully to face the wealthy investors and board members seated at the VIP tables near the front of the stage. But I did not stop at simply buying your debt. I wanted absolute control of the board. I tapped my phone screen one final time. The projection shifted seamlessly, displaying a legally binding, fully executed corporate acquisition charter. Over the past 48 hours, while you were busy trying to force me to arrange your floral centerpieces for free, Ms. Gallagher and her legal team approached your board of directors. We presented them with the forged ecological deeds. We showed them the impending federal indictment regarding the illegal riverfront development. And then we offered them a very simple choice. Go down with your sinking ship, or sell their controlling voting shares to Obsidian Holdings at a premium. I gestured smoothly toward the front row. As you can see, corporate loyalty only extends as far as the bottom line. The board of directors unanimously voted to sell. Obsidian Holdings officially acquired the controlling majority of Caldwell Enterprises shares at exactly 5 p.m. today. Several of the older board members in the front row refused to meet Preston, frantic searching eyes staring down at their expensive crystal glasses instead. The lead investors, the men and women who had just been clapping rapturously for his promotion, were now looking at me with profound, calculating respect. They understood the language of absolute power, and they recognized immediately that Preston was a dead man walking. He had nothing left to offer them but federal subpoenas, public scandals, and massive financial losses. I had become the undisputed queen of the board, and they were already realigning their allegiances to match the new reality. Preston stumbled backward, his shoulder bumping hard against the wooden podium. He looked like a man who had just watched the ground completely drop out from beneath his feet. "You cannot do this," he whispered, his voice stripped of every single ounce of its former arrogance. "I built this company from the ground up. I am the chief executive officer." I stepped right up to the podium, leaning into the microphone so my final words would echo forever through the history of Chicago high society. "You built a fragile house of cards on stolen dirt," I corrected him, my voice slicing through the silent ballroom like a freshly sharpened blade. "You are not a CEO, Preston. As the majority shareholder of Caldwell Enterprises, I have the unilateral legal authority to restructure the executive board at my discretion, and my very first official act is addressing the staggering fraudulent mismanagement of this firm." I locked my eyes directly onto his, holding his terrified, panicked gaze. "Preston Caldwell, you are publicly and permanently fired. Pack your things and get out of my building." He opened his mouth to argue, to scream, to mount any kind of defense, but absolutely no words came out. He was completely, utterly paralyzed by the sheer totality of his public ruin. I turned away from him, addressing the silent, captivated audience one last time. Furthermore, due to the massive, insurmountable debt accumulated by the former management and the imminent federal shutdown of the riverfront project, Caldwell Enterprises is no longer a viable corporate entity. Effective immediately, I am declaring the firm bankrupt. The corporate assets will be completely liquidated to repay the outstanding creditors. And since Obsidian Holdings is now the sole creditor, I will be dismantling this entire empire piece by piece starting tonight. Every single contract, every lease, and every remaining asset will be absorbed and repurposed under my direct supervision. The Caldwell legacy ends right here in this ballroom, buried under the very debts you tried to hide. The checkmate was absolute. I had not just defeated him, I had completely erased him from the corporate world. He was left standing on the stage as a broken, bankrupt fraud while I stood victorious, holding the keys to the entire kingdom. Pandemonium swallowed the ballroom. As I declared Caldwell Enterprises bankrupt, the investors surged toward the exits, desperate to salvage capital from Preston's smoldering empire. The jazz quartet fled, leaving only panicked shouts and the glare of projection screens illuminating the absolute destruction of the Caldwell legacy. I stepped down the heavy emerald silk brushing against polished marble. My security flanked me as I walked down the center aisle. I was not rushing. I had nowhere else to be. "Fiona, wait." The screech echoed. I signaled the guards to halt as Beatrice and Diana shoved through the crowd. They looked unrecognizable. Their haughty facades were entirely shattered. Diana wept uncontrollably, mascara ruining her makeup. Beatrice trembled, reaching toward me in a pathetic display of maternal affection she never genuinely felt. "Fiona, please!" Beatrice gasped, grabbing a guard arm when he blocked her. "You must listen. We had no idea about the forged deeds or crimes. Preston manipulated us. He forced us to testify against you. We never wanted to hurt you. We have always loved you. You are my flesh and blood." Diana nodded frantically, twisting her diamond ring. "Yes, Fiona. It was Preston. He poisoned us. He made us treat you terribly. But we are family. You cannot leave us with nothing. Carter does not have a job now. What are we supposed to do? Please forgive us. We can be a real family." I looked at the women stripped of their stolen power. I felt nothing for them. No anger, no sadness, no pity. They were just strangers who ran out of other people. "Money, you made your choices," I said, cutting through their sobbing. "You sold Uncle Silas for cash. You sold my sanity for a retirement fund. You traded my business for vintage champagne. Preston did not force you to make me eat in the catering kitchen. Preston did not force you to leverage my survival against floral centerpieces. You did that because you are cruel, greedy women who value people based on bank accounts. Well, my bank account is the only one that matters, and I value you at zero." I reached into my clutch and withdrew 2 thick legal envelopes. I dropped them onto the table where they mocked me an hour ago. The white paper landed next to the shattered champagne flute. "Those are your official foreclosure and eviction notices," I announced, watching their eyes widen in horror. "Obsidian Holdings owns the mortgages on the Whitmore estate and the North Shore mansion. Both properties are in severe default. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate before law enforcement forcibly removes you." "But where will we go?" Beatrice wailed, collapsing into her chair as the reality of total ruin sank in. "We have no money, no credit. We will be homeless." "I suggest you find a cheap studio apartment," I replied, turning my back on them. "I hear there is one available with a leaking ceiling and a view of a brick wall." I walked out of the ballroom, my heels clicking a triumphant rhythm against the marble floor. I did not look back at Preston, sobbing on the stage. I did not look back at my mother and sister, weeping over eviction notices. I walked out of the luxury hotel, stepping into the cool, crisp Chicago night air, leaving them to drown in the magnificent disaster they built for themselves. 3 months later, the dust settled over the Chicago corporate skyline. The implosion of Caldwell Enterprises remained the top story on every financial network. Federal prosecutors moved with breathtaking speed. Once my legal team handed over the forged surveys and stolen historical land deeds, Preston was formally indicted on 24 counts of federal fraud, corporate embezzlement, and financial racketeering. The government halted all construction on the riverfront, luxury development. The site was cordoned off as a federal crime scene, ensuring the rare glacial peat bog and its endangered botanical life would be protected. With his corporate assets frozen and his personal wealth entirely liquidated by Obsidian Holdings, Preston could not afford a decent defense attorney. He sat in a federal holding facility awaiting a trial, carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 30 years. Carter Caldwell, facing conspiracy charges, quickly turned state evidence against his older brother to secure a plea deal. The fallout for my mother and sister was equally devastating and self-inflicted. Exactly 48 hours after the engagement, Gala private security contractors, acting on behalf of Obsidian Holdings, arrived at the Whitmore estate and North Shore mansion. Beatrice and Diana were formally evicted. They were escorted off the properties, clutching only the few personal items they could fit into small suitcases. The luxury vehicles they had driven were repossessed by the banks. The designer gowns and priceless jewelry they purchased on credit were seized to pay down insurmountable debts, stripped of their stolen wealth and exposed as frauds to the entire city. They were exiled from Chicago. High society. The country club memberships they prized above all else were publicly revoked. Polite society dropped them with the same ruthless efficiency they had used to drop me. With no marketable skills and shattered credit scores, Beatrice and Diana were forced to rent a tiny dilapidated two-bedroom apartment in the worst neighborhood on the far south side of the city. Diana, engagement to Carter dissolved the second the Caldwell money evaporated. She now worked the early morning shift at a fast food drive-through, returning home every day, smelling of cheap grease instead of expensive French perfume. Beatrice, unable to secure employment due to her age and lack of experience, spent her days sitting in their cramped living room, bitterly complaining about her lost status to a sister who despised her. They were trapped in a miserable, impoverished existence of their own making, constantly turning their venomous anger against each other. I stood on the master balcony of Great Uncle Silas' magnificent Gold Coast mansion, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. The bitter Chicago winter finally melted away, surrendering to the bright, vibrant warmth of early spring. I looked out over the massive estate grounds, breathing in the sweet scent of blooming flowers. I had spent the last 3 months pouring Silas' incredible resources into fully restoring the historic botanical gardens surrounding the property. The dormant ivy roared back to life, covering the limestone walls in lush emerald green. Rare orchids and exotic lilies flourished in the newly constructed climate. Controlled glass conservatory I built behind the main house. It was a thriving, beautiful sanctuary, honoring everything Silas loved and everything I dedicated my life to preserving. Fiona, the final documents are ready. I turned around smiling as Miss Gallagher stepped out onto the sunlit balcony carrying a thick leather-bound portfolio, looking sharp and formidable. Behind her stood Arthur from the Historical Registry, who I recently hired as my lead archival director, and a small group of loyal, passionate botanical consultants I recruited to help me rebuild my firm. They were my true chosen family, a circle built on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than shallow greed and toxic obligation. I set my champagne glass down on the stone balustrade, walking over to the patio table where Ms. Gallagher laid out the paperwork. This was the final piece of Silas' grand vision and the ultimate culmination of my revenge. Using the liquidated assets from the destruction of Caldwell Enterprises and a significant portion of Silas' liquid fortune, I was officially establishing the Silas Whitmore Historic Lands Foundation. It was a massively funded nonprofit organization dedicated to acquiring, protecting, and restoring historically significant ecological sites across the Midwest. The foundation would ensure that corrupt corporate developers like Preston Caldwell could never again destroy protected natural reserves for cheap profit. We were turning the very dirt my mother despised into an impenetrable multi-million-dollar shield for the environment. I picked up the gold-plated pen Miss Gallagher offered me. I did not hesitate. I signed my name flawlessly across the bottom of the charter, permanently locking the funds into the trust. The legacy was completely secure. Ms. Gallagher closed the leather portfolio with a satisfying snap. "It is officially done," she announced, a rare, genuine smile lighting up her stern features. "Silas would be incredibly proud of you, Fiona. You executed his vision perfectly. You destroyed the monsters and you saved the garden." I picked up my champagne flute, raising it toward the clear blue spring sky. My friends raised their glasses, the crystal clinking joyously in the warm morning air. I looked out over the flourishing, vibrant botanical gardens, feeling a profound, unbreakable peace settle deeply into my soul. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter or the discarded, broken wife I was. Fiona Whitmore, the sole architect of my own extraordinary destiny. I had walked through the absolute darkest fires of familial betrayal, and I emerged completely victorious, holding the keys to a beautiful, unshakable empire.